in our spiritual life for some reason don't pay that much attention to coming down from the mountain. So I thought that was what I was going to talk about. And then I opened the news last night. And because I had not seen the news since Thursday afternoon, um, opening it on last night was something of a shock. And I didn't feel that we could actually talk about anything else or do anything else at this point. I think there come times in community life and in spiritual growth and learning where the most important thing you can do is just say the obvious. And the obvious being that there's murder happening all over. And so this morning, what I would actually like to do is something I don't do that often. Although it actually, I think, happens that I do it at the retreat from time to time, is I would like to teach halacha. I would like to teach sort of I would like to take a text of Jewish law, so to speak. And my teacher, Art Green, often says his response when people ask, okay, so you're all about a religion that's about love and love of God and love of people. Like, do you think there is a religious obligation? Like, does the sense of religious obligation mean anything to you? And his answer to that usually is, I totally believe in religious obligation, bein adam lechavero. That is, in things that are between people. He says, there I absolutely believe in religious obligation. And because it's like there, you have to create frameworks in which you are obligated towards other people. And I want to look, so what I'm going to do today, this morning, is I'm going to spend some time looking together at the way the obligations around life and the taking of life were framed in our in certain strands of our obligation tradition. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have us look together at the first chapter of the rules of murder and preservation of life. Just the title is very interesting, right? The title of this section in the Rambam, in the Mishne Torah, I'll say a word about the Mishne Torah in a second, is the rules of murder and the preservation of life. We're looking at an 11th century text. We're looking at a text from Maimonides, from the Rambam. At the time, this is one of his later pieces. He wrote it in the latter part of his life when he was already living in Egypt. He was an important community leader. He died in 1205. And he wrote this book actually as an attempt to democratize Jewish practice. He was well aware that the Talmud, the Gemara, sort of the tradition, had become largely inaccessible to people. It was so complex, so process-oriented, written in languages people didn't speak, and therefore both conceptually and technically was very difficult for people to access. He therefore decided he was going to start a project. He was going to put everything that was in the Talmud, everything that had been gathered as sort of Jewish tradition that was practiced, that was part of practice, into one sequence of books. He created 14 volumes, which would be done in simple, accessible language, in which there would be no process, there would be no arguments, no disagreements, just one bottom line. This is what you do. And sort of he was trying to distill the entire tradition up to his time into one simply straightforward presented text. And it's quite an amazing project. It's the most comprehensive attempt, comprehensive in terms of content, of course, not in terms of different opinions and arguments and processes, but it is one of the most comprehensive attempts in the Jewish history. And so we still go back to look at it from time to time. We still go back to study it. And one, of course, when studying it, has to remember two things. One is that for every opinion he brings, there is an opinion he did not bring which disagrees with it, because that's the way Jews do things. And the other thing to remember is that we're looking at an 11th century text, and the thing that we call halacha is a flowing river that has done a great deal of flowing since the 11th century. But still, I think it is very useful to look through this sort of as a reminder of what some of the fundamental issues that are being addressed and talked about when we talk about murder and the preservation of life in our tradition are. So I'm going to read and maybe comment a little on some of the text from the first chapter of this section. And like I said, if anybody would like to comment, because I can't see everybody, please put your name in the chat, and then I will call upon you to comment. I put the translation I found this morning on Safaria up online. I will be translating from the Hebrew as I go, because I never know. I already saw there are a few strange things in the translation, so I will translate as I go along from the Hebrew text. Hey. Anybody, this is the first chapter, the first section of the halachot of murder and preservation of life. Anybody who kills a human being, who takes the life of a human being, transgresses a commandment, a lotase commandment, a do not do commandment. As it is said, lot yirtzach. Right? That's very simple. Right? It appears in both versions of the Ten Commandments with no variations, no ambiguity about it. You shall not murder, right? Lo tirtzach. And therefore, anybody who takes a life, who murders a human being, has transgressed this. Ve'im ratzach bezadon, if one intentionally kills another person before witnesses, their punishment is death by the sword. As it says in the verse, they shall be revenged. And the tradition has taught that this is being executed by sword. And it doesn't make any difference whether one killed another with a sword or whether killed another with fire. In any case, the execution is with sword. Okay, so two things to take from this. One is that the punishment is about taking life. It's not about the process. It's not about the method. It's about taking life. The other one is that already in rabbinic times, the capital punishment for murder was negated, and it's that is alluded to. It's hidden in the text that we read when the Rambam says that the punishment is applied if one killed intentionally, if one murdered intentionally before witnesses. Now, we are used to a legal system in which, in order to ascertain guilt, one has to be able to ascertain, the lawyers here will speak to it better than me, but needs to be able to ascertain the fact. That is, you need to be able to ascertain that the person indeed did the thing. The rabbinic world neutralized capital punishment by requiring the ability to ascertain intention as well. That is, the witnesses in the rabbinic world, in order to actually carry out capital punishment, the witnesses had to be able to ascertain without any doubt intent on side of the murderer. And they wonder, how is that done? It says, well, the witnesses have to be able to say to the murderer, are you conscious of what you're doing? Do you understand that it is prohibited to kill a person? And do you realize that this is a capital crime? And the person has to answer and say, yes, I understand all of this, and it is with that intention that I am committing the crime. And under those circumstances, if that happened, they were ready to affirm capital punishment. As that never happens, that was the end of capital punishment in our tradition. Sort of the necessity to, it's a very interesting move, sort of saying, oh, in order to take a life, even in response to taking a life, we would need an absolute certainty about it that a human being can never have. Practically, that's what they're saying. Therefore, we do not have the arrogance to step forward and take a life, even in a case where a life has been taken. But that's sort of the move. That's the halachic move, which develops, in which what becomes, what is identified as a capital crime, a person killing another person, is then the power of not killing another person becomes so strong that it even neutralizes the Torah's instruction that murder is a capital crime. I skipped 2 sections here where he talks about another piece, which has rabbinic law already in the 1st and 2nd century sort of set aside, which was the idea of a relative's obligation to kill the murderer, which is very interesting, but I'm going to put aside for a second, and I'm going to continue on the next section, which is section number 4. Here, let me find it here. Yeah. I don't know, Judith. Judith asked if there's anything to say about the do not kill, do not murder. I don't know. I think do not murder is probably more precise, because there is in rabbinic midrash, in midrash halacha, in early rabbinic attempts to understand, there is a recognition, and we will see that in a few paragraphs, that there are circumstances under which taking a life is justified, and under which taking a life is actually something that has to be done. And so the rabbinic teaching says, there's an old rabbinic teaching that, so I'll put that aside for a second. But anyway, it is important for the rabbinic process to articulate that not every killing under any circumstances is prohibited, but that murder is prohibited. So I think, and we'll see examples of that in a minute. So I think that's probably the difference. I don't know the history of sort of thou shalt not kill, what that meant, which I assume is King James, sort of what the associations of that were in England. Judith, you are of course much more in a much better place to comment on that than I am. I don't really know sort of the whole sequence of English associations to that. The next paragraph, right? The court is warned not to take any ransom from a murderer. And even if the murderer offers all the money in the world, and even if the relatives of the victim want to let the person go, want to let the murderer go, because the soul of the person who was killed does not belong to the relatives. It belongs to the Holy Blessed One. And it is said, do not take ransom for a life from a murderer. And there is nothing that was more important. One second, let me move the text to make sure that you can see it. There was nothing that is more important to the Torah than shedding of blood. As it is said, you shall not pollute the land that you live on, because shedded or blood being shed pollutes the earth. Okay? So this is sort of, it's again, I think this is interesting to see, partially because of this middle section here about saying, look, you know, human life is not really your decision to take. Life is a gift. It is given to you and it is taken from you by God. You cannot buy and sell life. You should not buy and sell human beings. You cannot buy and sell life. You cannot decide that somebody who can pay money should therefore be punished for taking a life differently in a way than a person who cannot pay the money. Right? And there's an interesting thing about the relatives here, right? And about the sense of ownership and who is the victim and what does victimhood mean in this context, right? But the Rambam is very clear on that. The Rambam is very clear and says, this is not a choice. The choice of how we respond to a person who has taken a life is not a response of the family, is not a response of this, it's not the responsibility of the survivors and the family, right? The life is God's. The life that was taken is God's, and it is in that context that we must relate to it, because human beings do not own life. And it goes back to it's from the end of the book of Numbers that is sort of very, very clear and connects the shedding of blood to the capacity to live in the land of Israel, and says, if you shed blood that is not atoned for, will make the land spit you out of it. You will no longer be able to live in a place. There is no holiness. There is no relationship to God. There is no living in a holy land, in a place where blood is being shed and not taken care of and not responded to and not atoned for. It's worth looking at we're not doing it right now, but it's worth looking at the verses there at the end of Bamidbar, which are very powerful, saying there is no sense of creating sort of a meaningful, God-searching, holy, just society if blood is being shed on the earth that cannot be and is not being looked at and responded to and taken care of by the community. And in the next section, this murderer who killed intentionally, it is not the job of the witnesses or anybody who sees to kill them, right? It is not something that people in the street who see this happening are supposed to respond to and kill the person. It is not another person's responsibility to punish a murderer, ad sheyavo lebeit din, until the person comes to court and goes through a process and are found guilty. As it says also in the same section from Numbers, the murderer will not die until they have stood before the community in trial. This is the same for anybody who has transgressed on a capital crime. they should not be put to death until their trial has been finished in court. Now, there is an exception to that. When is that the case? That is the case when somebody has already transgressed and done this thing, this capital crime. But if one is pursuing somebody else in order to kill them, even if the pursuer was a minor, every single person, Kol Israel, every single person is obligated to save the one who is being pursued from the one who is pursuing them, even at the cost of the life of the pursuer. Right? So this is a very significant distinction the Rambam has made. There's a significant distinction, he says, between before the murder has happened and after the murder has happened. After the murder has happened, there is no responsibility, there is no right, nobody has the right to step up and punish the person who has done this. There is a community, the community sits in judgment, the community, upon sitting in judgment, makes the decisions of what to do. But says the Rambam, that is following, of course, the Gemara and so on, says the Rambam, that is very different if the crime has not happened yet. That is very different when you see somebody about to take the life of somebody else. When you see somebody who is about to take the life of somebody else, every individual has the responsibility to do, and we'll see he goes into detail in the next paragraph, to do they can to save the one who is pursued. And that could go as far as even risking or taking the life of the person who is pursuing, not as a punishment. No individual has the right to take the life of a murderer, but the obligation to save somebody who is in the danger of being murdered is so powerful that you can even risk the life of the person who is pursuing in order to do that. So he gives a few more details on that. So we'll read a few more paragraphs on that. 1 second, let me move this up. Okay. If the bystanders warn this person and the person is chasing them, even though they have not acknowledged that they received the warning, so it's not like the thing we talked about before where you have to know and get the intention and affirmed it, but if the person was warned, even if they did not act it, and they continue pursuing the person to kill them, that person may be killed. And if it is possible to save the victim at the cost of a limb of the pursuer, rather than taking the pursuer's life, if one can injure the pursuer and thus save the person, save the victim. For instance, if one can shoot them with an arrow or with a stone or with a sword and cut off their hand or break their leg or put out their eye, then that should be done. Okay? But if they cannot aim precisely, and the result may be that they kill the pursuer, then you can kill the pursuer, even though the pursuer has not yet committed the crime. As it says, you shall cut off her hand and not have compassion. So I'm going to say something about the use of that verse in a minute, which is an amazing rabbinic transformation of the biblical verse. But first, what the Maimonides is saying, this has nothing to do with punishment. It's not, you do not have the right to punish a murderer, and you do not, and it does not, because a murder has not yet happened at this point, and so there's nothing to punish for. says your obligation is to save the person to be murdered. And he says you should do everything you can do, even up to the extent of taking the pursuer's life. If you can stop the person, if you can save, right? It's not about that, it's about saving. If you can save the person some other way, at the expense of the pursuer's limb, or there's some other way you can save the person, go for that. But your priority is to save the person who is about to be murdered, and that priority pushes you as far as the as taking the life of the person who is pursuing. Now, the verse he's going to, and I see we're short on time, so I'm not going. Yeah, I'll just very, very quickly. From Deuteronomy 25. It's one of the more, often we have difficulty reading when we read these, I'm sorry, not Deuteronomy 25, it's Shmot 25, I think. Yeah. No, it's Deuteronomy. It's Deuteronomy 25. If this is the original verse, Deuteronomy 25:11. If two people fight, and the wife of one comes to save her spouse from the one who is hitting him, and she sets out her hand and grabs his genitals, you shall cut off her hand and not have compassion. Okay, in the Near Eastern context, this is a historical piece which has as much to do with fighting and damages as it has to do with the place of women in the public arena, in the public sphere. And I'm going to put that aside for a minute, because what the rabbinic world did here is a total reinterpretation of this, which takes it to a totally different place, which has nothing to do with gender. That is, in Rambam's reading, what he learns from this verse is that he sees this as a fight between two people, and he sees this as somebody being in danger, and he learns from this that the first thing you should do is, if you have to cut off the person's hand to stop the danger, cut off the person's hand. And if you have to do more than that, do not have compassion. Do whatever you have to do to start it. So he's taken what has been the verse, which in its original context is a gender-oriented public sphere kind of discussion, and he's learned something totally different about it, not gender-related, in which he has learned about the limits and the different kinds of intervention that one must do in order to save another person. And now, just because we're on time, we're short on time, I'm going to skip a little bit here again till section 10. Section 10, just to see, because this is, again, an interesting thing. The same rule of the pursuer applies to one who is pursuing another person to kill them, or one who is pursuing a betrothed girl to rape her. Because the Torah compares the two and says, discussing rape, just like a person rides against another to kill them, so is this matter. And it says further on, when it says, when it explains why the betrothed girl is not guilty for the rape, it says, put it out, and there was none to save her. Therefore, learned the rabbis, the implication of that was that if there was somebody who heard her shouts, certainly that person would have saved her with any way that was possible. Right? It's actually a beautiful reading of the verse that's saying, oh, she is definitely not guilty because she shouted out and there was no one to help her, because it is unimaginable to the rabbinic mind that somebody would have shouted out, people would have heard and not helped. Right? That is unimaginable. It is an absolute that if somebody hears somebody shouting out for help, right, and for them the two categories are a victim of an attempted murder or a victim of rape, everything possible in order to save that, in order to save the other person. That's a given in the system. The structure is then built upon that premise. Now I'm going to move forward to 13. Right? If a person could have saved the victim by doing something short of murder, but did not take the effort to do that, but went straight to killing the pursuer, this itself is then murder. And the person is then becomes liable to death and becomes himself a murderer. And then he says a very interesting thing, but the court itself will not execute this person. Right? It's a very, very interesting and delicate balance he's trying to hold. He's saying, right, there are circumstances under which if you use what we would call excess force to save another person that was not needed, says you have committed murder, the court would not kill you. Section 14. Anybody who could save another person and did not transgresses the commandment of you shall not stand by and see your friends, your neighbors' bloodshed. And so one who sees their friend drowning in the ocean, or bandits coming upon them, or evil animals coming to them, and has the capacity to save that person themselves, or has the capacity to pay other people to save that person, and did not do that. Or one who heard non-Jewish people or evil Jewish people finding ways to do evil or setting a trap, and did not tell their friend, or knew that, again, you have to think of the historical context here, knew that a non-Jewish person or a person trying to cause damage was going to come and cause damage to their person. And they could have solved this. They could have solved this issue by changing the thoughts or the opinions of the person who was going to attack, and didn't do that, or any of these modes. This person has transgressed. You shall not stand by when your brother's blood. And one, I'm in 15. I'm sorry, I have to keep remembering to move the text here. One who sees somebody chasing another to kill them, or chasing in order to rape, who has the capacity to save and did not do this, okay, has transgressed the active commandment of cut off her hand, which we remember in the Rambam does not mean a punishment, but means you should even take a limb in order to save a person who is being pursued, and has transgressed two negative commandments. Do not have compassion on the person who is chasing, and do not stand by when the blood is being shed. And even though we do not administer lashes, It's a very interesting place where the Rambam is playing about what does it mean to transgress something vis-a-vis what does it mean to be punished. When does the court take the authority to punish somebody for what they have done? Right? And he has a rule that you only administer lashes for a transgression in which you actively did something. But these are cases of a transgression in which your transgression was not doing something. So even though we do not administer lashes for these, because it is not doing something, they are very severe. Because anybody who destroys one life of Israel, it is as if they destroyed the entire world. And anyone who sustains one life in Israel, it is the entire world. Say this about human beings and not just about Jewish people as well, and in our learning. That's the last part. Oh no, I'm sorry. That was a different part that I was going to show. Yes. So that was what I wanted to read and share today. I'm going to just open the screen now. And there's, of course, a ton of stuff to talk about here, and there's many, many different details and confusions and disagreements and gray territory and all of those things. But I think this is what we need to be looking at this point. So I want to open, we have about 1.5 minutes left. I want to open for people who would like to just add one thought or something to put out now before we move on to the next program. You can unmute yourself and say something if you want at this point too.
I have been feeling very brokenhearted about what has been happening and appreciate your broaching this really difficult subject. So thank you, Evan. It's a little hard to think of all the kids coming in their costumes next.
Yeah.
Maybe have a nigun to help us transition and settle a little.
Yeah. 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 So, we're doing this strange thing because, right, on one hand, our physical territory has been tremendously limited. Like we're all closed inside our houses. On the other hand, the territory of our consciousness and awareness has been so broadly expanded, right? So we feel that things that are happened, right, all over the United States are very close to us because they're brought in, right? They're brought into our homes and through our TV and through our political systems. We sort of responsibility for them. It's a very complicated thing in which to, on one hand, hold that responsibility in that sense, and on the other hand, say, oh, there are other things we need to do in life also, which are the immediate thing that's happening in life that we need to work with. And it's a very, very hard balance to hold, result of our expanded awareness of things that are happening at great physical distance from us. So I'll take Cindy Joe's proposal. I'll take 1 minute just to 1 minute to sing something, 1 minute to sing quietly, and then we'll move on. Let's sit quietly for a moment. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being a supportive community for this conversation. And I am sure, sadly, that we will continue this conversation at greater depth and more thinking how we can support each other and support the larger community of which we are part. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan.